Hello, I'm Dr. Matthew Hardy. I'm Senior Lecturer in Architecture and Urbanism at the Prince's Foundation in London. I'm here to talk to you today about aspects of urbanism along the Euston Road in London. And here we are in an area of 18th and 19th century urbanism, and there's a number of features that I want to discuss here with you. First of all, we have buildings which are 3 or 4 stories in height, all accessed from a stairwell, and including elements of mixed use. So, for example, here we have a pub, closed unfortunately because of the pandemic, and also around the corner, small shops, hotels, restaurants, and so on. You can also see some apartment buildings purposely constructed around the early 20th century. In the distance is a church, and finally, also in the same street and all fronting up to the street alignment, we have some industrial buildings. So you can see in this very small area in one street, just off the Euston Road, we can see almost a perfect example of traditional 18th and 19th century urbanism. And I suppose it's fair to say that this begins here, just off the Euston Road, with the British Medical Association. Founded around a century ago, this large building now forms the home of the BMA, and if you like, is a address point for the medical profession and increasingly the medical industry. Gower Street, just off the Euston Road, in front of University College London. This is one of London's biggest universities. And I'm standing opposite the original University College London Hospital by Alfred Waterhouse, a red terracotta building in a cruciform shape which was designed to allow the air to circulate freely, important in those days because disease was believed to be transmitted through the air. Beyond that, you can see the modern University College London Hospital, one of the key research and training hospitals in London, and the centre of the Euston Road health, education, medical and data cluster. Sitting in the main square at the British Land Development. And what we're sitting in here is what's known as a privately owned public space, or POP. And this brings some interesting questions about the nature of public space, which Matthew Carmona, an academic from University College London, has been talking about recently in a series of papers and as a part of a large research project. And privately owned public spaces have a number of interesting characteristics. One is the presence of private security guards, which you'll see opposite us, and who may in fact ask us to leave very soon. However, one of the benefits of privately owned public spaces is that the standard of maintenance and programming of the space can be really very good indeed. And if you look at this space, we can see that the paving is absolutely perfect. It's much better and much cleaner than the general sort of paving that you find in London. Local children are able to use the space without hindrance or interruption, and also throughout the year the owners of such places program in a whole lot of interesting uses for the benefit of the office buildings surrounding. And so you can see there are pluses and minuses in these kind of new public spaces, and I think it's fair to say that Matthew Carmona has eventually concluded that privately owned public spaces have both benefits and disbenefits, and there may in fact be a new type of public space emerging which is both semi-public and semi-private. Just north of the Euston Road and just east of the British Land Development in which we spoke earlier, and this is a little enclave of public housing built in the 1960s and 70s by Cambly Council. At this stage, it was envisaged that the Euston Road would become an urban motorway, and so this development focuses in on this very quiet, very private square, which includes a little bit of mixed use, including a pub, a little shop, hair studio and so on, and generally onto a landscape courtyard. The idea was to create a private enclave well away from the noise and bustle of the motorway that was Euston Road. Drummond Street, a small street just parallel with the Euston Road and just north of it. Drummond Street is a fragment of the original 18th and 19th century urbanism of Fitzrovia. However, it was isolated by the construction of the Euston Road and is now rather isolated, surrounded by busy roads on two sides and the Euston Station on the east. And it's the Euston Station which is in the background. Drummond Street maintains a lively pedestrian environment which is characterised by South Indian vegetarian restaurants, and in fact for central Londoners is well known as a place for going to have a quick, cheap and nutritious curry. Just next to the work site for High Speed 2, Britain's new high-speed railway line that will eventually join London to Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds and points north. HS2 requires a very large extension to Euston Station, north of the Euston Road. This extension will add a series of high-speed platforms at a very low level, so there's an enormous amount of excavation, and as you can see, a very large construction site which has already required the removal of a graveyard and a number of houses, hotels and office buildings. East of Euston Station, which is the large bulk of building behind me. Major railway stations tend to have a front and sides, and the sides are not easy to access and they don't really provide much to the community around them. And that in a way is a metaphor for the position of Somers Town in which we're standing now. Somers Town is sandwiched between this amazingly rich developments, the new High Speed 2 development, the British Library, the Francis Crick Institute. It's close to University College London, and yet none of the benefits have flowed to the community which lives and occupies Somers Town itself. Somers Town built in the early 19th century as a working class neighbourhood, and one which has been successively regenerated over the years and yet still remains one of the poorest in London. Building behind me is the British Library. This is one of Britain's three reference libraries which receive, as of right, a copy of every book published in English. This means well over 20 million books today located on this site just on the Euston Road and also up in North Yorkshire. Readers come from around the world to access the range of manuscripts, and of course the general public also use it as a kind of third space, as cafes and internet access and those sort of things. And it forms one of the other keystones or anchor points of the emerging Euston Road knowledge cluster. Another key new actor in this knowledge cluster is the Francis Crick Institute, the salmon pink building with a curved roof. This is a major new research institute which researches all kinds of medical, technical and data issues, and links to the British Medical Association, the Wellcome Trust, University College London Hospital and other newer actors along the Euston Road. Garden, a small piece of undeveloped land just to the north of the British Library, which has been used as a temporary makeshift use before the development proceeds of a community garden which is available to residents of Summertown. In fact, this site is now proposed for a large extension to the British Library, which will remove some of the buildings shown in the distance and also provide further research space for biomedical and technical research institutes. It's an example of what we call tactical urbanism or meanwhile uses. These are uses which are permitted or encouraged on sites which are earmarked for future development, but for which, for one reason or another, development is not yet ready to proceed. They can be used by developers in order to increase the value of a site, to generate footfall, or, as in this case, to provide much needed facilities for local communities. But the question remains how long these uses are permitted to go on for. In this case, we know that there's a development now proposed to this site, so this could be all over in the next couple of years. Standing next to St Pancras International Station, this very large building was originally supposed to have been demolished and replaced by a modern station, or perhaps the station removed altogether. In the 1960s, a protest movement led by Sir John Betjeman, the poet and conservationist, succeeded in getting this building listed. Since then, it has become the terminus for the cross-channel services operated by Eurostar, high-speed services to southeast England and services to the London and Midlands, as well as having a group of 6 underground stations and also the Thameslink line which links Bedford with Brighton. So a very connected place and a magnificent station, completely restored and expanded in order to accommodate modern trains just before the millennium. Inside St Pancras Station, where the very large span roof by Barlow and Ordish from 1869 continues to span this interior space. As part of the redevelopment of the station, this retail mall was cut through from the space above in order to bring light down to the lower level where passengers circulate before getting on their trains. The development has brought a whole lot of very high-end retail into this area just to the north of Euston Road, and created something which is not only a station and also extremely well connected, but also something of a destination in its own right, at least before the pandemic. At the south end of the King's Cross development, you'll see on the left King's Cross Station, in the centre the original hotel now renovated, and on the right St Pancras Station. This is the absolute epicentre of pedestrian movement generated by these 2 stations and the network of underground and other railway lines that converge on this spot. And so it's an extremely connected place and a good place in which to anchor a new development. The King's Cross development on 57 acres of land to the north of this point is a 21st century piece of urbanism, and we'll have a look at some of the features of that in the closing part of this video. Close to the point where we looked at the 2 railway stations, looking to the north at the new King's Cross development. From the German gymnasium, which was the location of some of the games in the very first Olympics of the modern era in London, to a series of modern office buildings surrounding a small square, and then under construction, Google's new headquarters in London. Google's building, it will be their main focus for a new business which they're developing, linking health research, medical research, and analysis of big data. And to do that, they've been able to get access to data from the National Health Service and others, with the aim of developing apps and other data-based developments aimed at public health and disease control. In the King's Cross development, just to the east of St Pancras Station, whose flank can be seen there, as you can see from the queuing taxis, the space between is essentially a service road with just a few uses on both sides at ground level. Moving on to the King's Cross development, this large new office building in the foreground was originally built for the French bank Paribas, but following Brexit and Paribas' decision to relocate their headquarters elsewhere, the building was taken as a temporary measure by Google, whose new building we've seen just previously. This is one of the first areas of the King's Cross development to be complete, and as you can see, we have a privately owned public space in the middle here, beautifully landscaped, beautifully maintained with superb paving and so on, and providing a series of restaurants and other uses for the people who inhabit the office buildings during the day. Around the central space there's a series of large buildings, each of which occupies its entire plot. They're accessed by the front doors onto the square here, or from the streets on the other side. And one of the key differences, I think, between the 18th and 19th century urbanism that we saw at the beginning of this video and the 21st century urbanism represented by King's Cross is the nature of the public space. Here we have privately owned public space. We have very large buildings which are freestanding and yet used to define public space, and yet each building occupies its own plot. There are no party walls between these buildings. So although this has some of the spatial qualities of the 18th and 19th century urbanism we saw at the beginning, I think the actual land ownership and the nature of the buildings and the design is really rather different, and also I think fair to say something of a success, but in its own terms. On Goods Way, on the side of the Grand Union Canal, the Goods Way is about a third of the way up the King's Cross site from the two railway stations that we looked at before. In the distance you can see the Cambly Street Natural Park, which was designated in the 1970s after local residents discovered that this area, which had previously been used as a coal dumping interchange between the railways and the canals, had developed into the most incredible spot of biodiversity. Behind me is the Grand Union Canal, and behind that the Thomas Cubitt Granary building of around 1840. This was a major interchange between the canals that go across behind me and the new railways which came down from the north of England. And it was a place where railway trains were unloaded into canal boats and distributed around London. It's a large listed building which forms the centrepiece of the northern part of the King's Cross development. 10 years ago, when this site was first being developed, they were very keen to find an anchor tenant for this northern part of the site, and so they were absolutely delighted to get the University of the Arts London here. And in those early days, although the building was renovated, there was nothing else surrounding it at that stage, but it activated the site with 9,000 students a day walking up and down from the railway stations to the university itself. And so they were able and very keen and delighted to get activity onto the site from the very beginning of the development of the northern part. The university also contributes to the knowledge sector, which is such an important element along the Euston Road, as we've seen. In Coal Drops Yard, which was one of the recently developed parts of the site, and unusually developed for high-end retail. And I must admit, this is a bit of a surprise because this part of the site is far from the two stations, at least 5 or 10 minutes walk, and quite isolated by the Canal to the west and by the railway lines to the north. And yet it has formed something of a destination for retail with a series of very high-end brands now occupying these spaces, together with bars and restaurants and some night activities as well. So, in fact, this development sort of defies what retail common sense and creates a destination in its own right. Bridge over the Grand Union Canal on the west side of the King's Cross development. In the background you can see some apartment buildings which has followed the development of the King's Cross site, but which are not part of the King's Cross site and could be seen as a form of copycat or engendered development which has grown as a result of the success of the King's Cross development itself. In the background we have the gas holder buildings, which are listed structures used for holding pressure in mains gas in the 19th century, relocated from the southern part of the site where we looked at the Google building, and now turned into very high-end housing here. It may seem strange to sell a premium apartment inside something which was used for historically for holding coal gas, but I think that's one of the strange and kind of harmonious and successful features of this development, is the way that the historic fabric has been integrated into the modern uses. Large new office building under construction on the northwest corner of the King's Cross site is to be tenanted by Facebook, and it will form Facebook's new European headquarters, again with a focus on medical data and other sorts of research. An interesting field for Facebook to be getting into, and one which reinforces the emphasis along the Euston Road, as we've seen this afternoon, on health, medical, research, arts, culture and leisure. On Handyside Street, at the southern end of the park, which forms the centre of the very northern part of the King's Cross site. And this area of the site, which is remote from the two railway stations, is largely developed with housing. Starting from the left in the tall building in the white concrete with student housing, and then in the brick buildings to my left we have public housing, and then the building closest to me is high-end private housing. So there's a mix of tenures of different types of housing, and indeed some of the buildings yet to be constructed here will provide further very high-end housing at the far end and closing this square. So the developers have in a way phased their site with the highest uses closest to the station, that being the offices and international offices of some major companies, then the arts and leisure and retail in the centre, and then furthest from the railway stations, residential, public housing, and scattered amongst that some institutions. So finally, just over here we have the Aga Khan Foundation's headquarters. Behind me is some public housing for Camden Council. There's also a small cinema, a theatre, and turning back to the left, the Facebook building, which forms a barrier between the high-speed railway line and the remainder of the site.